It started the night before Halloween, just as I was drifting off to sleep. A steady knock echoed from the front door. It was almost midnight, and I wasn't expecting anyone. At first, I ignored it, figuring it was just my imagination or maybe a tree branch scraping against the house. But the knocks came again, 3 slow, deliberate taps, like someone waiting for me to answer. My heart thumped as I walked to the door, but when I looked through the peephole, there was no one there. The porch was empty, quiet except for the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. I even opened the door, stepping outside to see if anyone was hiding, but the yard was deserted, the street lamp casting long shadows across my driveway. A chill settled over me, but I forced a laugh, telling myself it was probably kids playing a Halloween prank. I shut the door and went back to bed, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that someone had been watching me. The next night, just before midnight, it happened again. I was brushing my teeth when the knocks came, those same slow, heavy taps on the front door. I felt a wave of irritation more than anything else, thinking it must have been the same kids messing around. This time, I stormed to the door and yanked it open, hoping to catch someone in the act. But once again, there was no one there. The street was empty, the silence somehow thicker than before. I felt an uneasy prickle at the back of my neck as I stepped outside, scanning the yard and the street for any sign of movement. A thick fog was settling in, turning the street lights into faint, ghostly glows. The stillness felt unnatural, like the whole world was holding its breath. I was sure I'd hear footsteps running away or catch a glimpse of someone hiding behind a bush, but there was only that oppressive quiet. Trying to shake off my nerves, I went back inside, bolting the door and checking the windows, telling myself it was all a prank, nothing more. But as I lay in bed that night, sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound felt amplified, every creak of the house making my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was waiting outside in the dark. Halloween night arrived, and I had almost convinced myself the knocks would stop. After all, it was the last night of spooky season. Maybe these kids would finally get bored. I'd stayed home, watching horror movies alone, trying to ignore how jumpy I felt every time the floor creaked or the wind howled outside. But as midnight neared, a heavy silence fell over the house, and I found myself listening, tense, bracing for it. And sure enough, right at the stroke of midnight, I heard it again. 3 knocks, louder this time, and with a weight that made my whole body tense. This wasn't a prank. It was too insistent, too real. I took a deep breath and walked to the door, my pulse racing. I waited for a long minute, hoping the knocking would stop, that whoever it was would just go away. But the knocks kept coming like they were testing my patience. Slowly, I peeked through the peephole, half expecting to see an empty porch. But this time there was something, or rather someone. A figure stood just outside, cloaked in shadow, wearing what looked like a dark hood. The porch light barely caught their face, but I could make out the glint of something pale, a mask or maybe white paint smeared across their skin. My breath caught as I backed away from the door, heart hammering in my chest. I waited, praying they'd leave. But the knocks continued, slower now, almost rhythmic. It felt like some kind of twisted ritual, like they knew I was on the other side, too terrified to open the door. The knock stopped abruptly, but I didn't dare check the peephole again. Instead, I crept back to my bedroom, locking the door and grabbing my phone, feeling a strange mix of dread and disbelief. I didn't sleep at all that night, and in the morning, I convinced myself it had to be a Halloween prank. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was over, that it was all just a bit of Halloween mischief. But the next night, the night after Halloween, the knocks came again. This time, they were even slower, more forceful, almost like they were calling to me. Every knock rattled the door, sending vibrations through the house. I stayed frozen in bed, my heart racing, knowing deep down that no one was playing a prank anymore. Whoever or whatever was outside wasn't there for fun. Finally, gathering my courage, I went to the door. When I looked through the peephole, I saw nothing. I opened the door slowly, peering out into the cool, silent night. The porch was empty, but a single object caught my eye, a feather, perfectly white, lying in the center of the doormat. It felt deliberate, like a calling card placed there by someone or something, that knew I'd opened the door. I slammed it shut, locking every bolt, my heart pounding. I waited for the police that night, who assured me they'd searched the area, but they found nothing. No sign of anyone, no footprints, not even the feather I'd seen lying on the mat. They looked at me like I was crazy, suggesting I might have been the victim of a Halloween prank, but I knew better. The knocking stopped after that night, but I still feel its echoes in the quiet. Every so often, when the house settles or the wind taps against the windows, I'm reminded of those 3 knocks at midnight, of the shadowy figure, and the feeling that I wasn't alone. I sleep with the lights on now, always bracing myself for that knock to return. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear it, a faint echo of 3 steady knocks, waiting patiently for me to answer. Growing up, there was always something eerie about the house nestled between my grandparents' place and my aunt's. The woman who lived there, Mrs. Harrelson, was a mystery. She was reclusive, kept to herself, and seemed to have an endless supply of cats wandering in and out of her overgrown yard. She rarely spoke to anyone and only left her house at odd hours, shuffling to her car in baggy clothes and muttering to herself. For us kids, she was the kind of person who filled the role of a local boogeyman. We didn't know much about her, but we didn't want to. When we played outside, she'd watch us through her window, her eyes peering out from behind dirty, torn curtains. If we got too close to her yard, she'd shout strange things, half threats, half nonsense, and we'd run off, spooked but laughing. Our parents warned us to stay away. But of course, that only fueled our curiosity. Halloween was the one time we dared get close to her house, and that year, we were feeling brave. On Halloween night, a group of us decided we'd go to Mrs. Harrelson's house for a dare. After all, we figured she was just a weird, lonely old woman, probably harmless. We walked up the cracked steps to her porch, the boards creaking under our feet, and hesitated, exchanging nervous glances. Finally, one of my cousins knocked on the door, and we all held our breath waiting. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, the door creaked open, and there she stood. Mrs. Harrelson was dressed in a ragged, oversized coat, her gray hair tangled and wild. But it wasn't her appearance that stopped us cold. It was what she held in her hands. She was gripping what looked like a severed head, lifeless eyes staring out at us. Her face twisted into a chilling smile as she held it up, murmuring something we couldn't quite understand. We froze, staring at her in shock, trying to convince ourselves it was some kind of sick Halloween prop. But as I looked closer, I felt a wave of nausea. The head wasn't a prop. The detail was too real. The skin pale and bruised, the hair matted with what looked like dried blood. My cousin gasped, and that snapped us out of our trance. We turned and bolted, our screams echoing down the street as we ran all the way back to my grandparents' house. That night, we told our parents what we'd seen, but they brushed it off as an overactive imagination mixed with Halloween jitters. Still, a few of the adults decided to check in on her the next day, just in case. When they came back, they seemed disturbed, but they wouldn't tell us much. "Just don't go near her house," was all they'd say, and they meant it. A month passed, and we tried to put the Halloween scare behind us. But then one night in November, we got a call from my aunt. She was frantic, saying Mrs. Harrelson had shown up at her house, wielding a long, twisted wire saw. She had tried to break into my aunt's garage, screaming and thrashing at the door. My aunt barely managed to lock herself inside until the police arrived. When they finally arrested Mrs. Harrelson, they discovered something that shook the whole neighborhood. Beneath her house, she had been digging tunnels, passages that stretched under her property and into the foundations of nearby homes. The police found strange objects down there, crude tools, worn ropes, and, to our horror, remnants of what looked like human bones. They never confirmed exactly what they found, but rumors spread fast, each more disturbing than the last. After that night, Mrs. Harrelson was taken away, and her house was condemned, boarded up, and left to rot. We never found out exactly who or what the head she held on Halloween belonged to. Some things are better left unknown, but even now, years later, I can't forget her wild, unsettling smile or the way her eyes looked past us, as if she was seeing something only she understood. When I drive past that old street, I still feel a chill run down my spine, as though her eyes are watching me from somewhere deep below in the dark tunnels beneath our feet. It was my sophomore year of college, and Halloween was always a big deal on campus. My friends and I had spent weeks planning our costumes, and by the time the party rolled around, we were ready for a night of fun. I dressed up as a witch, complete with a floppy hat and dark makeup. We headed to one of the biggest parties of the year, held at an old, off-campus house that had a reputation for wild nights. The place was packed, and the atmosphere was electric. I was having a great time, laughing with friends, dancing, and just enjoying the night. But then, as I was grabbing a drink, my friend Sam came up to me, looking tense. "Hey," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "There's a guy who keeps staring at you. He's giving me a bad vibe. Just stay close, okay?" I laughed it off at first, thinking Sam was just being overprotective. But when I looked around, I saw him, a man standing in the corner, dressed in a simple, plain black outfit with no obvious costume, just a blank white mask that covered his face. He was watching me, unmoving. I brushed it off, trying to enjoy the night, but as time passed, I couldn't shake the feeling of his gaze following me through the room. As the night went on, the party started winding down. My friends were ready to head to another house, and I told them I'd meet them there. I just needed to grab my jacket from the back room. I made my way through the thinning crowd, and after a few minutes, finally found my jacket. As I turned to leave, I saw him again, the man in the white mask, standing in the hallway just watching. I kept my eyes down, trying not to make eye contact, but the moment I stepped outside, I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I thought he was just leaving the party too, maybe going in the same direction. But as I walked, the footsteps kept pace with mine, echoing in the quiet street. I glanced back, hoping it was just a coincidence, but there he was, the mask glinting in the faint streetlights, following me at a steady pace. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that my friends were only a few blocks away. I could meet up with them, laugh about this weird guy, and move on. But the closer I got to the unfamiliar street, the more the man picked up his pace, closing the gap between us. I turned onto a quieter block, trying to lose him, but that only seemed to encourage him. Finally, he called out, his voice muffled under the mask. "Hey you, do you want to come inside? This is my place. We could hang out." I stopped dead. I didn't recognize the house, and I knew he was lying. I started to back away, trying to keep my voice steady as I said, "No thanks. I'm meeting my friends." But he stepped forward, blocking my path, gesturing to the house with his hand. "Just for a minute. They won't miss you." My heart pounded as I took a step back, glancing around for any sign of help. The street was deserted, and I realized that if I didn't act fast, he might force me inside. Summoning every ounce of courage, I turned and ran, not daring to look back. I could hear him behind me, the sound of his footsteps quickening, but I didn't stop. My only thought was reaching my friends, getting somewhere safe. I finally spotted them on the next block, laughing and talking near a street corner. I screamed their names, and when they saw me, their smiles dropped instantly. I reached them, gasping for breath, glancing back to see the man standing in the distance, watching us from the shadows. Without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I told them what had happened, my voice shaky as I recounted the man's attempts to lure me inside the house. They stayed close the rest of the night, refusing to let me out of their sight. And by the time we finally made it home, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But that night, and for many nights after, I couldn't shake the image of that blank mask or the sound of his footsteps echoing behind me. Even now, on Halloween, I'm extra cautious, keeping a close eye on my surroundings. Because somewhere out there, he's still lurking, looking for someone else to follow into the night. If you're enjoying the stories so far, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more creepy stories just like these. And hey, have you ever had a paranormal experience? Drop a comment below and share your story with us. We'd love to hear it. Now let's dive into the next story. It was Halloween night, and my friend Evan and I had decided to stay in and watch scary movies at his house. We were about halfway through a cheesy horror flick when we heard a knock at the door. It was pretty late for trick-or-treaters, but we figured maybe it was just some last-minute kid or a prank. Evan got up to check, and I followed, curious. When he opened the door, there was a man standing there. He wasn't in costume, and something about him felt off. He was probably in his 40s, wearing a tattered coat, and he had this blank look in his eyes, like he wasn't fully there. "Is everything okay?" Evan asked cautiously, keeping his hand on the door. The man just stood there, staring at us for a few uncomfortable seconds. Then he said, "I'm looking for someone," in this flat, distant tone. "Can I come in?" Evan shook his head quickly. "Sorry, I think you have the wrong house," he said, trying to sound casual. I could tell he was just as creeped out as I was. The man didn't move, didn't react. He just kept staring, his eyes flicking between us like he was trying to decide something. After another few seconds, he turned around and walked off, disappearing into the darkness. We closed the door, both of us trying to laugh it off, but there was this lingering tension in the air. We kept peeking out the windows, half expecting to see him standing in the yard, just watching us. After about 20 minutes, we finally started to relax and went back to the movie. We were getting into it, laughing at the terrible special effects, when Evan froze mid-laugh, his eyes fixed on the window. "Dude," he whispered, "he's in the backyard." I whipped my head around, and there he was, standing just beyond the window, his face barely visible in the shadows. He was staring straight at us, completely still, like he was waiting for something. My heart was pounding so loud, I could barely hear anything else. We didn't know what to do. Calling the police felt like an overreaction, but the whole situation felt wrong. Evan had the presence of mind to lock all the doors, and we turned off the lights, hoping he'd get bored and leave. We waited, barely breathing, as the minutes crawled by. Finally, after what felt like hours, we peeked outside again. The man was gone. The next day, I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to Halloween weirdness. But that evening, I got a text from Evan that made my stomach drop. "He's at your house." I looked out my bedroom window, and there he was standing in my front yard, staring up at my window with that same empty expression. This time, I didn't hesitate. I called my parents, and they called the police. But by the time anyone arrived, the man was gone again, leaving nothing but a sense of unease that clung to me for weeks. The police never found him, and no one else in the neighborhood reported seeing him. It was like he'd vanished. Evan and I tried to move on, but we both kept one eye out for him every Halloween after that. We never saw him again, but the memory of that blank, eerie stare still lingers. Every Halloween, I still catch myself glancing out the window, half expecting to see him standing there waiting. Halloween night had been a blast. The party was full of laughter, costumes, and just enough weirdness to keep things interesting. I decided to call it a night around midnight, heading home alone on a quiet stretch of road outside the city. I was halfway home, music playing softly, when I noticed headlights behind me, closer than I expected for this time of night. I shrugged it off at first, probably someone else heading home late. But as I kept driving, those headlights stayed glued to my rearview mirror, almost too close for comfort. I slowed down, hoping they'd pass me, but instead, the car matched my speed, sticking uncomfortably close. My pulse quickened, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't make out much about the driver, just a dark shape in the driver's seat. I tried to convince myself it was just another Halloween prank, someone having a laugh, but something about it felt wrong. Then, the car swerved slightly like the driver was testing me, trying to get closer. I sped up, my heart racing, but so did the car behind me. Every time I sped up or slowed down, they matched my moves perfectly. Panic started to creep in as I gripped the wheel, keeping my eyes locked on the road. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew I had to get away. The headlights suddenly swerved again, this time bumping the back of my car, sending a jolt through me. I looked in the mirror, and that's when I noticed it, a figure in the driver's seat, dressed in a long, dark robe and a hood. It looked almost skeletal, a pale mask or makeup covering its face in the shape of a skull. My stomach dropped. It was like staring at death itself, following me down that empty road. I forced myself to stay calm, focusing on the road ahead, planning my next move. Up ahead, there was a sharp turn, and I knew I had to take it carefully. As I approached the curve, the car behind me sped up, trying to force me off the road. I gritted my teeth, hugging the turn as tightly as I could, my car barely staying on the road. I felt the back of my car wobble, but I managed to hold steady. The car behind me, however, wasn't so lucky. It tried to take the curve at the same speed and lost control, skidding off the road and veering into a ditch. I glanced in my mirror, watching as the car spun out and came to a stop. Relief washed over me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread as I saw the driver, Death, sitting motionless in the front seat, staring in my direction. Then, without warning, he disappeared into the darkness. I pulled over a safe distance away and called the police, explaining what had happened. They assured me they'd send someone out right away, and I waited there, heart pounding, watching the spot where the car had gone off the road. By the time the police arrived, though, the car was gone. They searched the area but found no trace of it. No tire marks, no sign of anyone. Just an empty, quiet road. To this day, I don't know who or what was in that car. Was it a Halloween prank gone wrong? Or something darker? Something I don't want to understand? All I know is that every Halloween, I'm reminded of that chilling figure in the hood, of the feeling that I was being hunted by something I couldn't see. And every time I drive that stretch of road, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights coming up behind me again, with Death behind the wheel. It was Halloween, and we had one mission: find the houses with the best candy. Everyone knew the richer neighborhood a few blocks away handed out the big stuff, full-size candy bars, the kind you only dream about getting as a kid. But the quickest way there was through the woods, a dense patch of trees that cut a 20-minute walk down to just 10. It seemed like a no-brainer, so we all agreed to take the shortcut. There were 5 of us: me, Sarah, Alex, Danny, and Lucas. At first, it was just the usual Halloween fun, laughing, trying to scare each other, our flashlights bouncing off tree trunks as we moved deeper into the forest. The trees were close, the path narrow, but we weren't too worried. It was just another shortcut, and we were focused on the candy haul waiting on the other side. But halfway through, Sarah suddenly stopped. "Did you guys hear that?" she whispered, shining her flashlight back down the trail. We all paused, listening to the faint crunching of leaves that wasn't coming from us. Danny brushed it off, saying it was probably just an animal, but I felt a shiver creep up my spine. Something about it sounded too heavy, too deliberate. We picked up the pace, trying to laugh it off, but the crunching kept up, matching our steps. When we sped up, so did it. When we stopped, it stopped. I glanced over my shoulder and saw them. 2 men, dressed in black, standing at the edge of our flashlight beams. They were still, watching us, faces hidden in shadow. None of us recognized them, and something about their silence, their stillness, set every alarm off in my head. "Run!" Alex whispered, breaking the silence. None of us argued. We took off, sprinting down the narrow path, dodging roots and low branches, barely able to see where we were going. I could hear the others breathing hard, hear the pounding of footsteps behind us. The men weren't saying anything, just running after us, their footsteps heavy and fast. Branches scratched at my face, my legs burned, but I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see how close they were. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of why they'd be chasing a bunch of kids in the woods on Halloween night, but I couldn't focus on anything except getting out of there. Finally, we saw the street lights ahead, the warm glow breaking through the trees. We burst out of the woods, stumbling onto the pavement, gasping for breath. When I finally looked back, the path was empty. The men were gone, swallowed by the shadows of the trees, as if they'd never been there. We didn't wait around to find out if they'd follow us again. We ran straight to the nearest house, pounding on the door, begging the startled homeowners to let us in. They called the police, who came and searched the area, but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone following us. To this day, I can still feel the fear from that night, the cold, heavy silence of the men in black, watching us from the shadows. We never took that shortcut again, and every Halloween, I still wonder who they were and what might have happened if we hadn't made it out of those woods in time. I was about 8 years old when I saw her for the first and only time. It was late at night, and I was supposed to be asleep, but I'd woken up for some reason and decided to peek out my bedroom window. That's when I saw her, a woman sitting on the swing in our backyard, gently swaying back and forth in the dim light from the street lamp. At first, I thought I was dreaming. She was dressed in a torn nightgown, and her hair was tangled, sticking to her face. But the thing that made my stomach drop, the thing I'll never forget, was the dark red stains all over her. She was holding something in her hand, a glinting shape I quickly recognized as a knife. I stared, frozen. She didn't see me, or if she did, she didn't care. She just sat there, staring straight ahead with this hollow look in her eyes, like she was lost in some dark place inside her own mind. My heart was pounding as I finally pulled myself away from the window and ran to my parents' room. "Dad," I whispered, shaking his arm. "There's a lady in the backyard. She's covered in blood." At first, he mumbled something about bad dreams, but when he saw the look on my face, he got up. He followed me to the window, where I pointed out to the swing. I held my breath as he looked out, hoping maybe the woman was gone, that my imagination had just run wild. But then I saw his face go pale, and I knew she was still there. "Stay here," he whispered, and then he disappeared down the hall. I heard him unlock the back door and step outside. I peeked from my bedroom door, watching him go down the steps to the backyard. He called out to her, his voice cautious, steady. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need help?" She didn't respond at first, just kept swaying, her eyes fixed somewhere in the distance. Then, without a word, she stood up, the knife still clutched in her hand, and took a shaky step toward him. My dad took a step back, his hands up in a calming gesture. That's when she suddenly turned and bolted, running through our yard and disappearing down the street. He locked the doors, called the police, and then sat down with me and my mom, trying to keep us calm while we waited. The police arrived quickly, searching the area. They found her a few blocks away, trying to break into another house. The officers told us later that she was clearly not in her right mind, confused, muttering nonsense, and still holding the knife. When they finally managed to get her to calm down, she kept saying something about her husband, that she had to finish what she started. It turned out that she'd attacked her husband earlier that night. He survived, but she'd left him badly hurt and ran off in some kind of daze, ending up in our backyard. They told us she had a history of severe mental health issues, but that night, something must have pushed her over the edge. For weeks after that, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her sitting on that swing, staring off into the night with that empty look in her eyes, the knife resting in her lap. Even now, years later, I can still feel the chill down my spine when I think about her. Sometimes I'll glance out at the swing in our yard and half expect to see her there, swaying back and forth, lost in her own world. It was one of those perfect Halloween nights, the air cool and crisp, and the streets buzzing with kids dressed as superheroes, witches, and ghosts. My sister and I were especially excited. We'd spent weeks planning our costumes and knew exactly which houses had the best candy. She was 13, old enough to be in charge for the evening, and I was 9, thrilled to be tagging along with her on my first big Halloween night out. We'd made it through the first few streets without a hitch, filling our bags with candy and laughing at each other's spooky faces. But as we turned onto a quieter street, I noticed a white van parked a little way down the block. It was an older van, no windows on the sides, and something about it made my skin prickle. I didn't think much of it at first. It was Halloween, and plenty of parents were out watching their kids. But as we moved from house to house, I noticed the van creeping along, inching forward every time we moved. My sister didn't notice it at first, too busy pulling me from house to house. But when we stopped at the 5th house and turned around, the van was right there, parked at the curb. The driver sat still, shadowed behind the wheel, watching us. My sister frowned, glancing back at me as if to say, "Stay close." We kept going, but each time we finished at a house, the van moved again, trailing just a few houses behind. It was like the driver was waiting for something, biding his time. My sister's grip tightened on my hand as we walked faster, but the van sped up too, inching closer each time. Finally, as we approached the next house, the van pulled right up beside us. The driver rolled down the window, a man with greasy hair and hollow eyes. "Hey kids," he called, his voice low and smooth. "Need a ride? I've got a lot more candy here." My sister didn't respond. She just gave him a hard look, pulling me along faster, heading toward the nearest porch. But he kept talking, his voice following us down the sidewalk. "Come on," he coaxed. "I'll take you wherever you need to go. Got some great treats back here." He patted the side of the van, smiling, his eyes fixed on us. We ignored him, practically running up the steps of the next house. But as we waited at the door, glancing nervously back at the van, we realized he hadn't moved. He was parked at the curb, watching us, his smile gone now, replaced by a cold, empty stare. I remember the sinking feeling in my stomach, realizing this wasn't just a Halloween prank. My sister made a quick decision. "We're going home," she whispered, taking my hand and leading me quickly down the sidewalk, cutting through a few yards to put as much distance as possible between us and the van. But as we walked faster, so did he, the van crawling slowly along the street, the engine humming in the quiet night. Every time we looked back, he was there, lurking, like he was waiting for us to slip up. We were only a block away from home, but it felt like a mile. My sister practically dragged me, muttering for me not to look back, but I couldn't help it. The van kept following, creeping closer and closer, until we finally reached our driveway. We bolted up the front steps and burst through the door, slamming it shut behind us. My sister locked it, her hands shaking as she peered through the window. The van had stopped at the end of the driveway, the driver still watching us, his eyes fixed on the door. Then, as if making a final decision, he stepped out, his shadowed figure moving toward the house. My sister grabbed the phone, ready to call for help, but before she could dial, my dad appeared in the hallway, alerted by the noise. He looked out the window, taking in the scene in one quick glance, and without a word, opened the door a crack. "I'm calling the police," he shouted, his voice firm and unflinching. "Get out of here." The man froze for a moment, staring at my dad. Then, as if realizing he'd lost his chance, he backed away, his face hidden in the shadows. He got into his van, slamming the door shut, and sped off into the night, the taillights disappearing down the street. The police came soon after, but by then, the man was long gone. They took our statements, patrolled the neighborhood, and told us to be extra careful. But they never found him, and no one knew who he was or where he went. For weeks afterward, I get chills every time I saw a van like his. I'd glance out the window, half expecting to see those dark, empty eyes watching me from the street. Halloween was never quite the same for me after that. Even now, when I think back to that night, I can still see him in my mind, a shadowy figure lurking just out of reach, waiting, always watching. It was late, and I just wrapped up a long shift at work. The roads were dark and empty, nothing but me and the hum of my car as I made my way home. I was looking forward to finally crashing into bed when something caught my eye up ahead, a figure standing still in the shadows on the side of the road. As I got closer, I realized it was a clown, red nose, painted face, colorful hair, and an eerie grin stretched across his face. He didn't move, just stared as I drove past, his head slowly turning to follow my car. I tried to shake it off. It was Halloween season, people pulled pranks like this all the time. But I couldn't shake the strange feeling that settled over me, like someone had walked across my grave. I was glad to leave that clown behind as I pulled into my neighborhood, eager to forget the weirdness and call it a night. But as I turned into my driveway, I felt my stomach drop. Standing there, right in front of my garage, was another clown. This one held a bright red balloon, bouncing slightly in the breeze. He was closer than the first one, close enough that I could see the disturbing details of his makeup, the thick, black lines around his eyes, the painted smile that stretched wider than any human mouth should. He didn't move as I stared, frozen behind the wheel. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and pointed directly at me, the balloon swaying with his movements. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank set up by some local teenagers. Maybe there was a Halloween event I didn't know about. But when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, my heart began to race. Two more clowns appeared from around the side of the house, their painted faces catching the light. They had the same eerie, exaggerated smiles, and they began walking toward me, each step slow and deliberate, like they knew they had all the time in the world. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I threw the car into reverse and tore out of the driveway, my hands shaking as I tried to stay on the road. In the rearview mirror, I could see them standing there, watching me, that red balloon bobbing up and down as they tilted their heads in unison. I drove around town for what felt like hours, trying to calm down, telling myself it was all some elaborate Halloween prank. But no matter how I tried to spin it, something about it felt too personal, too real. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to go back home, hoping they'd be gone, that this bizarre nightmare was over. When I pulled into the driveway, everything looked normal. The clowns were gone. The driveway was empty. I let out a shaky breath, laughing at myself for being so freaked out. I locked the car and headed for the front door, eager to put the night behind me. But as I reached out to grab the doorknob, I froze. Tied neatly around the handle was a red balloon, gently swaying in the cool night air. I didn't sleep that night, and every so often, especially around Halloween, I still find myself checking the driveway, half expecting to see those painted faces waiting for me in the dark with another balloon and that same unshakable grin. It was supposed to be just a fun, creepy night. Halloween had rolled around and my friends and I wanted a thrill. We'd all heard about this abandoned house just outside town. The kind people said was haunted. The kind of place you'd only go to on a dare. Perfect for Halloween. So, we grabbed flashlights, bundled up, and headed out, laughing and joking like we had nothing to fear. The place was every bit as creepy as we'd hoped. It was a 2-story farmhouse, windows cracked and dark, surrounded by overgrown weeds that seemed to reach out for us as we walked up. But as we got closer, I noticed something weird, a pumpkin on the front porch, freshly carved, with a crooked, menacing grin. We all stopped, staring at it. Why would an abandoned house have a fresh jack-o'-lantern? It felt wrong, like someone was waiting for us. We brushed it off, convincing ourselves it was just someone else's idea of a Halloween prank. Laughing nervously, we pushed open the front door, which groaned loudly, like it was warning us. Inside, the air was stale, and the place looked even worse than we'd expected. Peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and that silence so thick you felt it in your chest. We split up, poking around with our flashlights, calling out to each other to see who could find the creepiest room. After a few minutes, we all met back in the main hall, ready to call it a night. But just as we were about to leave, we heard a sound from upstairs, a slow, deliberate creak, like someone was shifting their weight. We froze. No one was supposed to be there. Did you guys hear that? I whispered, barely daring to breathe. Before anyone could answer, a shadow moved at the top of the stairs. It was a man, tall, with a scruffy beard and eyes that glinted in the dark. And in his hand was a long, gleaming knife. We didn't wait to see what he'd do. Someone screamed, and we all bolted, stumbling and shoving our way to the door. But the man started down the stairs, his footsteps steady, calm, as if he knew every creak in that house. He wasn't running, he was hunting. We burst out onto the porch, half tripping over each other as we sprinted down the driveway. Behind us, we heard the man step onto the porch, his footsteps echoing off the rotting wood. We didn't stop until we reached the road, panting and gasping, checking over our shoulders to make sure he wasn't following us. But the porch was empty now, the pumpkin staring back at us with that same menacing grin. When we finally caught our breath, two of my friends, Dan and Chris, admitted something. They planned a Halloween prank. They'd been in touch with an old buddy of ours, who was supposed to be at the house waiting to scare us. Only, they hadn't told the rest of us, thinking it would add to the surprise. But here's the thing, our friend never showed up. He bailed last minute and texted Dan just before we left that he couldn't make it. The man with the knife? He wasn't part of the plan. Terrified, we called the police and told them what happened. They checked the house that night and again the next day, but found no sign of the man. No footprints, no knife, nothing. Just that pumpkin still sitting on the porch, grinning like it knew the secret we didn't. I still don't know who that man was or why he was there, but I haven't been able to shake the feeling that he'd been waiting. And sometimes, on Halloween nights since, I swear I can still see that pumpkin's crooked grin staring back at me in the dark. If you enjoyed these true horror stories, you won't want to miss our next video. Check out 8 true, disturbing bad friends horror stories by clicking the card on the screen or finding it as the previous video on our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience. We'd love to hear your stories. Stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video.